Hello, I'm Connor McLean, and today I'll be talking about the space race and how it was kind of a mirror for the Cold War, how it ebbed and flowed, first as a kind of harsh competition, thawing into full cooperation, as well as how the perception of the space race may in fact be marred in the fact that it was not always about uh, cutthroat competition between the US and the USSR. Uh, so, onwards to space, starting with Sputnik and the start of the space race. Now, many people will put Sputnik, the launch of the Sputnik satellite, as the start of the space race, and in fact the first blow in it. But it begins earlier than that. During World War II, a number of Nazi scientists, weapons developers, were being recruited by both the US and the USSR, basically being given amnesty for their part in developing the weapons the Nazis used to fight the war with in exchange for working in the research and development programs of the militaries of the US and the USSR, respectively. Um, the most prominent in our case being Oppenheimer, Dr. Oppenheimer, who worked on the V-2 rocket program for the Nazis. Dr. Oppenheimer is often portrayed as a bit of a dreamer who was more interested in spaceflight than weapons creation, but was essentially forced under threat of execution to work and develop these weapons for the Nazis. And he's reported as having said the first time a V2 successfully launched and struck a target that the rocket performed flawlessly. It was simply pointed at the wrong target. Regardless, the recruited scientists helped propel both nations' research divisions forward, uh, especially in terms of rocketry between who all they managed to pick up in the rocket from the V2 rocket program. And this leads into Sputnik being launched in 1957 on October 4th by the USSR, the first artificial satellite put into space. And this surprised many people. Um, Although many scientists were surprised more at the timing than the event itself, as this was during the International Geophysical Year, which was an international event put together by a bunch of countries with the express purpose of putting a small artificial satellite into orbit around the Earth. Um, and a number of the countries involved, so they would directly, weren't just working research, but would directly involved in attempting to launch and put something into orbit, including both the U.S. and the USSR. And it's actually been recorded that a number of the scientists of the U.S. were relieved more than chagrined at the success of the USSR, as they felt that they had simply opened the door for the rest of the world into the space exploration, proving that it could be done and wasn't simply a waste of money, as opposed to, getting ahead and getting a lead into the space races would later be looked back on. Which moves us into the race to the moon, which is generally considered the meat of the space race. Um, and so Sputnik spurred the U.S. into action uh, with the creation of NASA in 1958. However, despite now a primary organization to base all their efforts around, the U.S. continued to lag behind the USSR, as the USSR claimed a number of firsts in space, with both the first animal and first person. Um, Remarkably, in November 3rd of 1957, the Soviets managed to put a dog, Laika, into space, only a month after the successful launch of Sputnik. However, took them a few more years before they successfully put a person into space. And the first person they put in space was also the first person to orbit the Earth, Yuri Gagarin, on April 12th of 1961. The U.S. would eventually match these, but not until many years later, at least after the first animal. The U.S. wouldn't put an animal into space until they put a chimpanzee into orbit on January 31st of 1961. They did, however, follow it up a few months later with their first man in space, Alan Shepard, on May 5th of the same year. Um, Besides the fact that the Soviets were simply pushing ahead much faster, um, there were some considerations as to how uh, resources were being applied, and this is something that'll be talked about a little later once I get to the sources as well. But after the successful launch of Alan Shepard, uh, President Kennedy kind of threw down the gauntlet with the statement of that by the end of the decade they'd put a man on the moon. And this is where the whole idea of, the first person on the moon being the final goalpost for the space race comes from. Was this final kind of flag planted in the ground, figuratively and literally once we finally get to the moon. But this leads into the Apollo program and the USSR equivalent, the Soyuz program, uh, as they head into the moon and develop a number of new technologies needed for this endeavor. And unfortunately, both programs would be marred by incident and loss of life, as during a training exercise in what was supposed to be a non-hazardous environment, the crew of the Apollo 1 were unfortunately killed when their command capsule caught fire during a training exercise. And by the time the ground crew could actually get the capsule open, the crew had already perished. They were simply stuck in. Conversely, the solo pilot of the Soyuz 1, Vladimir Komarov, was the first in-flight space fatality. He was supposed to be going on a 3-day test, including a docking with the unpiloted Soyuz 2. However, he had a number of issues crop up, including a failure of the control systems, causing the craft to kind of go wild. And while Komarov was able to use the manual systems to stop it, they scrubbed the mission. But during the emergency reentry, a fault in his parachute system caused his primary chute to fail, and his reserve chute to become tangled with his drogue chute, which is essentially an emergency burn-off chute to burn off a lot of excess speed that's used before the full chutes deploy. But this caused him his descent speed to reach as high as 40 meters a second, or about 89 miles per hour. And shortly after this failure, his capsule would crash into the Earth and burst into a ball of flame, which unfortunately killed him. But despite these setbacks, the programs both recovered and pushed forward, with the U.S. program starting to finally get a number of firsts of their own, as the Apollo 8 mission was the first lunar orbit, manned lunar orbit, and produced one of the most iconic photos of space exploration from that era that I will show and talk about later as well, as it's just a gorgeous photo. But this eventually led into the Apollo 11 landings, as allowed the U.S. to put the first man on the moon, the first person to walk being Neil Armstrong on July 21st of 1969. Now, after this momentous event, the U.S. would eventually launch an additional 5 moon landings. 6 missions launched, but the Apollo 13 mission never actually managed to land due to its fairly notorious malfunctions in flight. The movie is phenomenal, by the way, and a wonderful and fairly accurate representation of what happened and how they fixed it. But Apollos 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17 would all follow Apollo 11 and land on the moon, totaling up about 25 man days of time on the surface outside of their landing craft. Now, after essentially having lost the space race, now the USSR shifted from landing on the moon to space stations, which they did so quite wonderfully. Excuse me, as they put in 6 different space stations in orbit, having launched an additional 2 that simply either failed to deploy properly or were damaged in flight. But still, 6 additional space stations in orbit in use was quite impressive. The U.S. only managed 1 with Skylab. The Russians' first space station was put up in orbit in 1971, and Skylab wouldn't be launched until May 14th of 1973. And Skylab itself was also a joint mission with the European Space Agency. which kind of shows partly how space has already been worked on as a cooperative endeavor. So, um, from here, however, we kind of start to see the end of the USSR and the start of cooperation, how it would ebb and flow and shift. Um, so after the uh, Apollo mission, um, the Cold War kind of started to enter a time of détente as cooperation became more common and relations with the USSR and the US started to thaw. Um, this is first primarily seen in the Apollo-Soyuz test project, which took place over July 15th through the 17th in 1975. And the idea behind this was to create a universal docking apparatus that was eventually named the APAS 75 to allow spacecraft of different nations with different specifications to actually dock with each other in case of emergency and need of rescue for uh, other astronauts and cosmonauts, or just in case of emergency on board, or just resupply and overall joint mission use. Um, it was quite successful, and it was actually shows off just how well relations started to go amongst the different space agencies. As the American and Soviet commanders very famously kind of floated towards each other, shaking hands as kind of apex of the mission. But beyond that, the two of them, the American commander Stafford and the Soviet commander Leninov, became lasting friends after this. Leninov was the godfather of Stafford's younger children, and Stafford actually gave a eulogy at Leninov's funeral back in October of 2019. And it really does kind of show how the idea of anybody who's been into space, or brothers, this camaraderie of space explorers, cosmonaut or astronaut. Um, and this is only further reinforced after the full collapse of the USSR as joint missions became more common. Starting with the Shuttle Mir program in 1993 that went up until 1998, which was basically just getting rides where you could, cosmonauts on the United States shuttles, or astronauts on Russian rockets up to the Mir space station, built by the Russians, for extended stays and research trips. And this led fully into the International Space Station project, which started in 1998 and continues to this day. Um, it really can't be seen with just how well cooperation has gone, even in the current times, as with all the difficulties with Ukraine and the Russian aggression. They still brought American astronauts back since we've ended this shuttle program years ago now, and have no way to get our own astronauts either up or back down. Um, but it really does show how cooperation has always been kind of where we were headed with space, and to an extent where we've always kind of come from, um, which we kind of talk about now in my scholarly sources here. The ones that I referenced for this project include Sputnik, the space race in the Cold War, which is a very interesting paper discussing just the Sputnik event itself, how different it could have been, and the implications of both the event happening and the repercussions. The idea being that it talks about how the U.S. absolutely had the resources and ability to put a satellite into space, possibly years before Sputnik ever happened, but has issues with the legality of it. The idea being that they were kind of looking at spy satellites, even back then, and the legality of putting an object in space to orbit over other countries' territories. Airspace is very easy to understand the idea of, but you get back out into space and beyond just terrestrial beings, how exactly does that work? Is it legal to orbit something over another country's territory without permission? Um, and the paper talks about how there was basically two ways they figured that they could get away with it and set precedent for it, which was either launching an innocent little scientific satellite under international auspices without provoking complaints, and thereby establishing by common consent the right to orbit satellites over the territory of other countries. The other way being to simply let the Soviets do it, because the Soviets didn't have to play nice with all the other countries in the world that the U.S. was kind of worried about the same way that the U.S. did. Um, and by launching this and talking about it and showing it off, they kind of established that precedent that it's okay to just launch satellites and orbit them over people because it's over the planet, not over anybody else. And that's kind of one of the things they talk about. One of the quotes from Donald Quarles, was a space agency director at the time. The Russians have in fact done us a good turn unintentionally in establishing the concept of freedom of international space, which is an idea to go forward. But it's also an idea that has always kind of existed and uh, or at least was always the ideal of the scientific community, and it started here and followed through all of space exploration. That space doesn't belong to anybody. That we are exploring it as a species, not as one country or another. We simply make the advances to get there, and what we learn should be shared with all, because you can't own space. And this brings us to the legacies of Apollo 11, which gives a lovely little summary of the Apollo 11 mission as well as the Apollo program in general, but mostly touches on how those programs affected us and what exactly they gave us, from how they shifted our personal perceptions of what is and isn't possible, to the technologies that they gave us, as well as how it simply inspired a whole generation of young men and women to pursue careers in STEM. Um, Going back a little bit to the perceptions of the general public's lovely quote they use from the creator of the Twilight Zone, Rod Serling. He once said, "Fantasy is the impossible made probable. Science fiction is the improbable made possible." And the paper goes on to use that with following it up with Apollo 8 made spaceflight to other worlds probable, while Apollo 11 made their exploration possible. And you can really see this in how popular media at the time it kind of showed off. And you go from the old 50s, the 40s and 50s, Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, space exploration and sci-fi, into Star Trek in 1966 and Star Wars in 1977. Um, Truly kind of showing off just how much our idea of exploring space has changed. What we expected to find out there and how we expected to get out there and how it had to kind of make sense now because we had been to space and we had been to other places, other bodies in our solar system. Um, and then finally, the social construction of the space race then and now. This was a very interesting paper that kind of argued that the perception of the space race has been skewed with how we look back on it, and that cooperation has always been the precedent, not where we ended up. And this points out the idea that uh, the Russian Sputnik satellite was just it was pretty much innocuous, since where the scientists were a little surprised at when it happened, but not that it had happened, because it had been launched during the IGY, as well as just kind of showing off how different groups work together a little bit more throughout the space race than perhaps we take into precedence, but uh, and that the idea that it was only ever just a thinly veiled ruse to show off the new rocket technology. Uh, Show off rocketry to each other government was not really the point. And while it may have been at the start, it was never really the end goal. And I mean, with everything that was developed afterwards and where we went and how they went about it, it really doesn't even look like it was about rocketry and ballistic missiles at the end of the day anyway. So then we get into the primary sources that I use. And this is the first 2 pages of a memo. Oh, I need to fix that still. Oh, so this is the first 2 pages of a memo um, for President Kennedy back in 1961 about the space program overall. The first page here is interesting, and mostly the first 2 points. Uh, the first being that uh, due to their concentrated efforts and earlier emphasis on large rockets, the Soviets are ahead of the U.S. in uh, prestige through technological accomplishments in space, and that the U.S. has greater resources than the USSR. They just haven't marshaled those resources to achieve leadership. With the second page really having the interesting one in point C, uh, the country should be realistic and recognize that other nations, regardless of their appreciation of values, will align themselves with the country they believe will be the world leader, the winner in the long run. Basically, the one that manages to actually do things and says so as much. Dramatic accomplishments in space are being increasingly identified as a major indicator of world leadership. It really is just reinforcing the idea that the space race was a little more political than anything technological for clout as it was, especially in the 60s. Just after Korea, just and right before Vietnam, and eventually into Vietnam, is the height of uh, the Cold War. And so it's a very interesting memo to simply talk about it and to recognize all of this. And it even goes on to talk about manned exploration of the moon uh, as an achievement, not just with great propaganda value, but essential uh, towards extra knowledge and success in space. Which again kind of emphasizes the idea that it wasn't about weapons technology, it was about science and doing better and learning more about ourselves and our universe that we live in. And then the next one is a scan of President Nixon's diary from July 20th, which was the date of the Apollo 11 moon landing. And this doesn't really show anything, but it is just an interesting look into the world and into different sources because it's so normal. I guess is the best way to put it. Um, just a little excerpt of who the president talked to, what he was doing, and just there, right at 11:45, so little note. The president held an interplanetary conversation with Apollo 11 astronauts, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin on the moon. I mean, they just landed. That's a huge accomplishment. And they call it the president. And it's just there, little note in a diary. It's so interesting to see how people kind of record history that they live through. And I mean, this was an event that I'm sure people recognized would be important, but even then, it was still just a part of their daily lives. And it's so interesting to kind of see that. And then my final primary source here is the photo Earthrise, photographed by Apollo 8 astronaut William Anders on December 24th of 1968. This is the first photo of Earth taken by a person not on it that I talked about earlier. And it's such a beautiful shot of the planet, and it really makes you understand just how small our planet is compared to the rest of the galaxy that it exists in. How vast space is, and how small our little planet is, and how small each of us is. Not in a bad way, just in a, oh, there's so much more out there to find. As well as, how much we have to do to protect this planet that we live on because we need a home to come back to. And one of the more interesting uh, phrases attributed to this that I have seen before is how this photo really made us stop to recognize that the Earth was a beautiful but delicate blue marble in a desert of black. And I think that's interesting because it really does emphasize how much we need to protect the planet. And they also uh, mention the fact that this photo was taken in 1968 and the first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970. This picture really did, I think, help create the first environmental movement, environmental protectionists, because it's our home. Why wouldn't you want it to be nice to come back to? But finally, we move on to why is the space race important? Why is looking at it important? Especially why is looking at it this way important? And I think for three major points. First is how we perceive history? How do we look back at everything? We have the very common story with the Cold War and with the space race that it was a direct competition between the U.S. and the USSR. Like it was this, the moon was always this great goalpost that we were trying to get to, and the Russians struck first with Sputnik, and then they got the first person into space. But we managed to, come from behind and get a man on the moon first. And it's just this huge kind of almost underdog story, is the way that I think it likes to get told sometimes. But this was a story very attributed later. I mean, the moon wasn't even made the goalpost until 1961 by Kennedy. Uh, and exploration of space didn't stop after we got people on the moon. I mean, there were multiple moon landings. The Russians simply shifted focus to something else. So the idea that the space race was kind of this big competition is almost just inherently flawed to begin with. But it's important to understand how we perceive that, and why we perceive it as such. And maybe we need to reevaluate how we look at it and see it more as the cooperative focus that it was. With how, yeah, there was a race to the moon, but how much we gained and shared after, because the space race wasn't ever really about racing to space. It was about getting into space and exploring it. Um, it's also important because through understanding the different eras and the different parts of the space race, we can trace shifts in public opinion, technology, and geopolitics. You can see when the USSR starts to fail by how cooperative they tend to be with other space agencies and with the US in particular. You can see how public opinion was in the early 50s, um, or the late 50s, with the launch of Sputnik, and how people were mostly just really excited by it and the prospect of it. And it wasn't until the 60s where it's kind of used as like the U.S. is falling behind kind of scare tactic almost to push funding further. And then of course there's also just, we can use it to trace technology, and that's one of those things that I think is always kind of terrifying. The first manned powered flight was in 1901, I believe, 1901 or 1909. Orville and Wilbur Wright piloted the first plane in the 1900s. 60 years later, they put a man on the moon. One of the brothers was alive to see it happen. And that is wild to me. And part of that is we can use this to see just what technologies were created and evolved through this. And the Legacies of Apollo 11 paper discusses this at length too, with a long list, and to read just a few of them: computer chips, air conditioning, life support systems, medical diagnostics machines, memory foam, and just let's keep going with all these technologies developed in support of these missions and were opened up to the general public. I mean, how many of us sleep on memory foam mattresses? How many of us have uh, had X-rays or MRIs? I mean, you're more than likely watching this on a computer right now, or phone, using a computer chip created because of the space race. It's just interesting to trace back where we are now with where all it came from. And then finally, of course, one of the important reasons is to learn from our past so we can chart a better course into our future. We can see the shortcomings and failures of governmental policy in space exploration and in the geopolitics of such, as well as the successes in the programs and the technologies and what worked and how better to move forward with it. Because we have plans right now to go back to the moon, to put a permanent moon base presence in the next few years. Talk of the first humans to Mars as early as 2033. We're not destined to be held to this planet for much longer. I believe heavily in our lifetime we will see the start of true exploration of our solar system, manned exploration of our solar system, the first colonies on the moon, on Mars, in orbit. And we have to learn from where we came from so that we can see the best way forward and not make the same mistakes. Because mistakes will be made, of course. It's what happens whenever you do anything new. But when we can learn from mistakes made in the past so that we can find ways not to make the same ones, it just makes it so much better and so much more interesting with what we explore. Because who wants to see a program failed because a rocket exploded for the same reason that Challenger did, for the same reason that an Apollo rocket did? But how much more interesting it could be, and just how much captivating it could be with other issues crop up, or better, successes. I mean, look at The Martian. This was a wonderful book and movie about a man being left behind on Mars and the lengths that public opinion and his fellow astronauts would go to simply get him back. It boggles the mind to kind of think about where we could be in another 50 years. But we won't know unless we learn from what came before us, so we can find a better way forward, hand in hand with each other. And that's why it's important to look back at all of this, both how we see it and how we can change that, and then to look towards where we're going. So, these are the bibliographies for both my scholarly sources and primary sources. Thank you for your time. I know this went a little long, but this is a very interesting subject, I think, especially since it is kind of indicative of the future of humanity almost. Maybe not immediately, but in what it can promise for us. So, thank you for your time, and I hope you have a pleasant day. Goodbye.